Welcome to the Deep Dive. We take complex sources, cut through the noise, and give you the knowledge you need. Today we're jumping into Chapter 20 of Essentials of Pediatric Nursing. We're focusing just on bowel elimination alterations and those specific GI disorders in kids.
Yeah, this is really foundational stuff for anyone going into peds. We're aiming to build a kind of mental map here because GI illnesses, they're just so common in childhood, and honestly, they carry a huge risk for the most frequent life-threatening issue in kids, which is dehydration. It happens fast. So our goal really is to grasp the anatomy quirks, get the assessment down pat, and know which conditions need immediate action versus, longer-term support.
Okay, let's start there then. The first big point is that kids aren't just small adults. Their GI system is fundamentally different.
Exactly. The infant GI tract, it's just not fully cooked, so to speak. It's not really considered mature until about age 2. Think about the basics. A baby's mouth, super vascular. And since everything goes in the mouth, it's a constant open door for infections.
And I guess the muscles are weaker too initially. Is that why spit up is so common?
That's a big part of it. The lower esophageal sphincter, the LES, its muscle tone is often pretty immature until maybe 1 month old. That makes that normal physiological reflux, that spit up, incredibly common. Then you've got just the sheer size difference. A newborn stomach holds, 10 to 20 milliliters?
Yeah.
Like a marble. Compare that to maybe 1,500 milliliter in a teenager. It's a massive difference.
And the length of the small intestine too, that seems really important for absorption.
Oh, absolutely. An infant has only about 250 centimeters of small intestine. An adult, around 600. So if there's any disease or, say, surgery that reduces that length in an infant, they lose a much bigger proportion of their ability to absorb nutrients. That can lead to some serious long-term problems.
Okay, so if we link that immaturity to fluid balance, this is where it gets really critical, right? Why do babies dehydrate so much faster?
Well, for one, they just need more fluid relative to their size because more of their body weight is water to begin with. But the really crucial part, especially up to age 2, is that a huge percentage of that water is extracellular fluid. That's the fluid they lose first and fastest with vomiting or diarrhea. It's gone almost immediately.
And they lose fluid in other ways too, even when they seem okay.
Yep, that's insensible fluid loss. And kids lose tons of it. They have a higher metabolic rate and, importantly, a much larger body surface area compared to their weight. Think about a preemie. That ratio is like 5 times greater than an adult's. They're just constantly losing heat and fluid to the environment. Plus, you factor in fever. For every degree Celsius rise in temp, a child loses about an extra 7 milliliters per kilo of fluid over 24 hours. It adds up fast.
And their own bodies can't really compensate well?
Not very well, especially when they're really young. Infant kidneys are immature. They simply can't concentrate urine effectively. So that makes them prone to dehydration, obviously. But also, you have to be careful not to cause fluid overload when you're rehydrating them. It's a delicate balance.
Okay, that makes sense. So, with that foundation, let's shift to the nursing process. We're bedside with a child, GI issue suspected. What's the absolute first rule for assessment?
Always go least invasive to most invasive. That means inspection first, then auscultation, then percussion, and palpation is always last. If you start poking a tender belly right away, the child tenses up, and you might miss other important findings.
Makes sense. So during inspection, what visual clues should jump out at us?
Look at their color. Pallor could mean anemia or maybe severe dehydration. Yellowish skin or eyes, jaundice, points towards liver issues. Then check the abdomen shape. Is it sticking out, protuberant? That could be fluid like ascites or maybe a mass. Or is it sunken in, depressed?
Yeah.
That often signals dehydration or maybe a high blockage.
Okay. Then we listen auscultation. We're listening for bowel sounds. What if they're too fast or too slow or gone?
Right. Hyperactive sounds, really fast gurgling. That's common with things like gastroenteritis or simple diarrhea. But hypoactive, very slow sounds, or worse, absent bowel sounds.
That's a major red flag. You have to listen for a full 5 minutes to confirm absence. If they're truly absent, it strongly suggests some kind of obstruction, and you need to report that immediately.
And that brings us to palpation, the last step. What's the emergency finding we absolutely cannot miss here?
Tenderness is key, but specifically rebound tenderness, pain that gets worse when you quickly lift your hand off the abdomen, and pain focused in the right lower quadrant over McBurney's point. Those are the classic warning signs of appendicitis. If you find those, you stop the exam and report it right away. No messing around.
Got it. Beyond the hands-on exam, we often need tests. Can you give us a quick overview of the common diagnostics for GI problems? What should nurses be ready for? Sure, it depends on what you suspect, of course. You might see orders for a KUB. That's a kidney, ureter, bladder x-ray. mainly looking for obstruction or constipation patterns. Barium studies, like an upper GI or barium enema, help visualize the structure and function of the tract, and stool samples are crucial, checking for OMP, ova, and parasites, or for hidden blood using a hemoccult test. Nurses need to know how to prep the child for these and what the results might mean.
Okay, so let's say we've identified a fluid volume deficit. What's the single best way to track fluid status day to day?
Daily weights. Hands down, nothing beats an accurate daily weight using the same scale, ideally at the same time, naked or with a dry diaper. Our goal is straightforward. We want good skin turgor, skin snaps back quickly. We want to see tears when they cry. And urine output should be at least 1 milliliter per kilogram per hour.
And for parents at home with a sick kid, vomiting, or diarrhea, what common drinks should we tell them to absolutely avoid?
Yeah, this is important. Steer clear of high-sugar drinks. Things like fruit juice, soda, even sports drinks sometimes, or Kool-Aid. All that sugar actually pulls more water into the bowel and can make diarrhea worse. We want complex carbs to help bulk the stool, and often avoid milk products initially during the acute phase.
All right, let's pivot to some specific acute GI disorders, starting with that big one, severe dehydration. How does the body try to compensate, and when does it fail?
Well, the body tries hard. The comparison charts show it well. In moderate dehydration, the first thing you usually see is the heart rate going up. The body's trying to keep blood circulating. But here's the tricky part. Blood pressure often stays normal until dehydration is really severe. So if you wait until the BP drops, that child is already heading towards shock. It's a late, ominous sign.
So when we need to rehydrate, what are the go-to tools?
The gold standard for mild to moderate dehydration is oral rehydration solution, or ORS. It's got a specific mix, usually around 75 millimoles per liter of sodium and about 13.5 grams per liter of glucose, designed for optimal absorption. And for calculating IV maintenance fluids, we still rely heavily on that standard holiday cigar formula. 100 millimoles per kilo for the first 10 kilos of body weight, 50 millimoles per kilo for the next 10 kilos, and then 20 millimoles per kilo for every kilo after that, calculated over 24 hours.
Okay. Thinking about acute illness again, the type of vomiting can tell us a lot. What's the absolute red flag vomit characteristic?
Bilious vomiting. Green or yellowish-green vomit. After the newborn period, that is never, ever normal. It screams intestinal obstruction, maybe something like malrotation with volvulus, which needs surgery now. That's very different from, say, the projectile non-bilious vomiting you might see in a 3 to 6 week old. That classically points towards pyloric stenosis, where you might even feel that little olive mass in their abdomen.
Gotcha. Two other emergencies to quickly cover. Intussusception and appendicitis. How does intussusception typically present?
Intussusception is that telescoping bowel. The key feature is often intermittent pain. The child has sudden, severe, crampy abdominal pain, draws their knees up, screams. And then, between episodes, they might seem perfectly fine, even playful. The classic, though not always present sign, is that stool mixed with blood and mucus described as currant jelly stool.
And for appendicitis, what's the really scary sign that things have gotten worse fast?
So appendicitis usually starts as vague pain, maybe around the belly button. Then it moves and localizes to that right lower quadrant, McBurney's point. It gets progressively worse. But the terrifying sign is sudden relief of that severe pain. If the child suddenly says, "Oh, I feel much better," you have to immediately suspect the appendix has ruptured or perforated. That's a surgical emergency, contamination of the abdomen.
Okay, let's briefly touch on congenital anomalies. Cleft lip and palate, besides the obvious feeding challenges, what's a major long-term risk?
Because of the connection between the palate and the eustachian tubes. These kids are at really high risk for chronic otitis media, middle ear infections, often with fluid buildup. If that's not managed well, it can lead to significant, even permanent, hearing loss. And post-op, after repair, protecting that suture line is everything. Supine or side-lying position, maybe arm restraints, sometimes a Logan bow device.
And the difference between omphalocele and gastroschisis, why is knowing that crucial right at birth?
It's all about the covering. With an omphalocele, the abdominal organs herniate out, but they're contained within a protective sac, the peritoneum. With gastroschisis, there's no sac. The bowel is just freely exposed to the air. That means massive fluid loss, huge heat loss, and a very high risk of infection. So gastroschisis needs immediate sterile covering, like with saline-soaked gauze and plastic wrap, strict temperature control, and careful handling to prevent injury and infection. Omphalocele care is critical too, but that sac offers some initial protection.
All right, shifting gears now to chronic, longer-term GI issues. GERD is super common, but when does it cross the line from normal reflux to actual disease?
Right. Simple GER, or reflux, is common. It becomes GER, the disease, when that reflux causes complications.
Hmm.
Things like persistent irritability, feeding refusal, poor weight gain, or respiratory problems like chronic cough, asthma, apnea spells, or even that weird arching posture called Sandifer syndrome during or after feeds, which is a pain response.
Mm.
Management often starts conservatively smaller, more frequent feeds, keeping the baby upright for 30-45 minutes after eating, maybe thickening the formula or breast milk.
Okay, and then inflammatory bowel disease, IBD. How do we differentiate Crohn's disease from ulcerative colitis?
The key differences are location and depth. Crohn's is typically segmental. It causes inflammation in patches, can skip areas, and can affect anywhere from mouth to anus. And it's full-thickness inflammation, going through the entire bowel wall. That full-thickness part is why Crohn's often leads to complications like strictures, fistulas, and abscesses. Ulcerative colitis, or UC, is usually continuous, starting in the rectum and moving up the colon. It typically only affects the colon, and it's superficial, just involving the mucosal layer, the inner lining.
And the impact on kids with IBD goes way beyond just gut symptoms, doesn't it?
Oh, hugely. Nursing care has to be really holistic. Yes, we manage meds and symptoms, but we also have to address the major psychosocial impact. Things like poor growth, delayed puberty, body image issues, especially if they need surgery and an ostomy, medication side effects. It affects their whole life.
Got it. Another chronic one, celiac disease. What's the classic look of a child with untreated celiac?
Because of the damage to the intestinal villi and the resulting malabsorption, the classic picture is often a child with a really distended, swollen-looking belly, but with very thin, wasted-looking arms, legs, and buttocks. And the treatment is absolute. A strict, lifelong gluten-free diet. No wheat, no rye, no barley. Period. It's tough, but essential.
Lastly, let's tackle a really common, often misunderstood issue. Constipation that leads to encopresis. Can you explain what's happening there?
Right. Encopresis isn't usually willful defiance, though can look like it. It's typically fecal incontinence or soiling that results from chronic constipation and withholding. What happens is the child has painful bowel movements, maybe due to a hard stool. That pain makes them afraid to poop, so they hold it in. Over time, that retained stool gets larger and harder, stretching the rectum. Eventually, the rectum loses its normal sensation and tone, and softer, liquid stool starts to leak around that impacted mass, causing the soiling. It's often involuntary.
So the management has to break that whole cycle.
Exactly. It's often a combination approach. First, you might need a clean-out phase to deal with the impaction. Then, it's about behavior modification. Things like scheduled toilet sits, usually twice a day, timed after meals to take advantage of the body's natural gastrocolic reflex, which stimulates bowel activity. And lots of positive reinforcement rewarding the effort of sitting, not just success. Plus, dietary changes, adequate fluids, sometimes stool softeners, and definitely counseling families against ineffective or shaming tactics.
Wow. This deep dive really highlights how vigilant pediatric nurses need to be with GI issues. From catching those subtle dehydration signs early to knowing those critical red flags like bilious vomiting or rebound tenderness, rapid assessment is key.
It really is. And that need for vigilance carries right through into managing the chronic conditions. What often makes the biggest difference in the long run for kids with IBD or celiac or even severe constipation and encopresis, it's often less about the technical skill, like starting an IV perfectly, although that's important too, of course. But it's more about nurses' ability to build trust, to educate, to support, and really empower the family. They need help navigating complex diets, medication schedules, sometimes really challenging behavioral plans, often for months or years. That sustained counseling and partnership is just crucial for the child's physical and emotional well-being.
That's a really powerful point to end on. Thank you so much for joining us for the deep dive. We hope this look into pediatric GI nursing helps you in your practice.